This is part 4 of my Chaska Brick video series, which covers the production years 1881 to 1893. Here is a lithograph of St. Paul from 1883. It is still fairly easy to pick out the core of the city along the Mississippi River. Buildings in St. Paul continued to get larger, and they were generally composed of brick and stone. In the lithograph, several buildings stand out, including the Second State Capitol Building, the Union Depot, the Church of the Assumption, the Metropolitan Hotel, the Merchants Hotel, the St. Paul Custom House, the Ramsey County Courthouse, the Market House, and the St. Paul Levee. This is a lithograph from Minneapolis from 1891. Its milling district continues to dominate the city skyline, but a downtown district has also become pretty evident. In addition, several buildings also stand out, including the Humboldt and Washburn Mills, the Stone Arch Railroad Bridge, the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad Depot, the Minneapolis City Hall, the Minneapolis High School, the West Hotel, the Old Minneapolis City Hall Building, the Minneapolis Chamber of Commerce, the Minneapolis Presbyterian Church, and the Union Depot. Lithographs and maps, like the St. Paul and Minneapolis views shown previously, continued to be popular, but they were also a great tool for historians. Although there were no other lithographs drawn of Chaska during this time period, other good resources were produced. This map, included in the Geological and Natural History Survey of Minnesota, 1882 to 1885, shows the geological features of Carver and Scott counties, with Chaska in the center. The History of the Minnesota Valley was published in 1882, and it contained many historical facts about Chaska and its brickyards. Sanborn fire insurance maps were produced for many towns and cities across the United States. In 1885, they produced a set for Chaska, although it did not include the entire town. This is a small version of the maps, which are combined to give the entire town perspective. The large-scale version shows many details which are not included here. To start off, the city square is shown in the middle. One block west was the Carver County Courthouse. Guardian Angels Catholic Church was another landmark. Across the street was the Catholic School. The German Evangelical Church was located across the street from the courthouse. Finally, one of the few references to the Chaska Brickyards was the location of Andrew Rydell's brick kiln on the north side of town. In 1885, the Minnesota Farmer ran a story on Chaska, which included a town map very similar to a Sanborn map. Once again, the town square was shown in the center. This map also showed the Rydell and Beerline brickyards on the north side of town. The Minnesota Farmer map included a few of the brickyards on the northeast edge of town, a rare tidbit of information. Finally, in 1891, another set of Sanborn fire insurance maps were produced for Chaska. This version of the maps included a much wider perspective of town. The updated maps depicted the town square, the Moravian Church, the public school building, St. John's Lutheran Church, and the town hall. Chaska appeared in several business directories, including this one for 1882-1883. This directory listed 2 breweries and 11 saloons, although that was not the image Chaska wanted to portray to the rest of the state. The directory claimed Chaska had 1,200 residents, and since the brickyards regularly employed around 400 of them, that was about 1/3 of the population. The brickyards provided steady employment, but it was only available about half the year. It was also a dangerous occupation, not just for the workers, but for the owners too. This graphic shows the various causes of brickyard accidents at Chaska. First, horses were valuable workers, but they could be ornery at times too. Belts and gearing, with few safety features, were highly dangerous. John W. Gregg, one long-running brickyard owner, got his clothes caught in gearing and was severely injured. Another brickyard owner, Herman Brinkhouse, fell 15 feet when the rail he was leaning against broke. However, clay slides were the greatest hazard to the brickyard workers. The men digging clay were at the bottom of the pit. Heavy shells of clay would occasionally break loose and fall on the workers below. At least 5 men were killed and many others injured from clay slides. Working with rail cars was also dangerous. Filling and moving boxcars in and out of the brickyards took a coordinated effort. One small mistake could be fatal. Things were not always rosy between the brickyard owners and their workers. A lengthy article in the Minneapolis Evening Journal on June 9, 1887, shed some light on this topic. The article called the Chaska Brickyard owners brick barons and said they had a grip on Chaska. Although the article may not have been totally accurate, it must have been close, due to the flurry of letters to the editor that appeared in response in the Chaska Herald. Brickyard workers, a mayor, shop owners, a brick mason, citizens and owners all tried to tell their side of the story. To break it down, the barons and the workers each had a perspective. The barons were established in Chaska, spoke English, were generally well off, often banded together, were heavily invested in their brickyards, their profit or loss depended on many factors, and they tended to have ownership in stores their workers utilized. The workers could either be from or new to Chaska, may or may not understand English, tended to be poor, did some unionizing, worked for a low daily wage, their jobs depended on the profit or loss of their owners, and they needed goods year-round. Pictures also tell the story. Reuben Melvin, one of the barons, is shown in the photograph on the left. He is well polished and wearing a suit. The brickyard workers were generally a rough-looking bunch. The Minneapolis Evening Journal article said the barons ran the town, basically setting the rules. They would intimidate workers to vote a certain way, controlling the local politics. If workers rebelled, the barons would intimidate store owners to refuse service to these men. The barons would also intimidate anyone who tried to help these workers. The system was not set up in the workers' favor. They could not afford lawyers or expensive court cases. For most, they depended on their job to just scrape by. Smartly, the owners banded together in a brick manufacturers association. Rather than competing against each other, all their brick was sold under one entity. This ensured a common pay scale, so one owner wasn't trying to undercut the others. However, the owners could go too far. They intimidated workers who joined the union and withheld a portion of their wages if they quit. Some of the workers joined the Knights of Labor, a union that pushed for worker rights, fewer hours to the workday, and an increased daily wage. Their power came from worker strikes. The owners had a lot of money invested in their brickyards, so they had a lot to lose. Though the workers were paid fairly low, those wages were the largest chunk of the owners' expenses. The profit or loss of the owners depended on the various supply and demand factors. The bottom line was that the prosperity of one depended on the other. Therefore, both sides had to work together. The brickyard owners were smart. They generally shared ownership in a Chaska store, knowing their workers required these supplies. If a worker became problematic, the owner could refuse to sell that worker those needed supplies. Since brickyard employment was only half the year, the job was not ideal. In the off-season, the workers became indebted to the owners because they still needed goods and services. There were many complicated issues between brickyard owners and workers. The railroads, which had once been cheered and welcomed, became the villains at times. However, they continued to expand. The Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railway built a 31-mile segment from east of Cologne to Minneapolis, which was completed in January 1881. This gave Chaska another direct railroad connection to Minneapolis. The new line still required trains to cross the bridge along the north edge of Carver. The new stretch of railroad connected into the old line between Carver and Cologne, at the Benton Junction. Now let's look at the supply and demand factors for the 1881 to 1893 period. The price of the goods was even harder to track. The Chaska Brickyards were making many different types of brick, and each had their own price. The cost of production was tied highly to the price of labor. As the brickyards grew, so did their payrolls. The second largest cost was for wood, which quadrupled between 1880 and 1885. As for natural conditions, storms and floods continued to plague the Chaska Brickyards. The winter of 1880-1881 produced numerous heavy snow and blizzard events. Train traffic was shut down in many areas due to huge snowdrifts. Hundreds of men were employed by the railroads to help dig out their lines. When the snow melted in the spring of 1881, a huge flood followed. Hundreds of homes were flooded and bridges were closed. This even affected the low areas around St. Paul. As for the Chaska Brickyards, on the eastern edge of town, that also meant more flooding and downtime. This may have been the tipping point for several brickyard owners. Clay had been discovered on the north side of town, which was less impacted by flooding. Summer storms also wreaked havoc on the Chaska Brickyards. One storm in early September 1884 destroyed 210,000 brick at the Rydell Yard, and a total of 755,000 at all the yards. Technology continued to improve. As for mining the clay, carts on tracks were still let down into the clay holes, where they were filled by the workers. Steam power would then pull them up to the brick manufacturing area, which usually began on the second story. From the second story, the clay could be dumped directly into the clay mixers and brick machines. One Chaska Brickyard even shipped raw clay to St. Paul, where a terracotta plant had been built on the eastern side of town. This plant was called the Minnesota Terracotta Lumber Company, and it built fireproof clay blocks for use in larger buildings. Most modern brick machines no longer required the clay to be weathered. And there was also a trend toward having one machine mix the clay with sand and water before it went to another machine to mold the bricks. The mixing machines were known as pulverizers, grinders, or pug mills. To mold their bricks in the early 1880s, most of the Chaska Brickyards were using the Gurney brick machine. These machines would push the clay into wood and metal brick molds, like the ones pictured here. The Chaska Brickyards also took advantage of their local expertise, which included both the beer line and S families. The beer lines were jacks of all trades. They were involved in flour mills, real estate, a creamery, a general store, a hotel, multiple brickyards, a repair shop, and making brick molds. The S family was a little more focused. They were involved in a blacksmith shop and wagon repair, and then with a foundry and machine shop. In 1891, the beer line machine shop was located on the corner of Pine and 4th Streets in Chaska. Although the beer lines manufactured brick, ironically they built their shop of wood. The S machine shop was located on the corner of Walnut and 3rd Street and was made of brick. Michael Beerline was a main inventor, but his brother Jacob also helped out. Their first invention, in 1884, was a machine that could sand brick molds. Just like baking with non-stick cookware today, brick molds had to be dipped in water and covered in sand to prevent the clay from sticking to them. The brick molds were covered in water and then fed one by one into the sanding machine. As they passed under the hopper, they were covered in sand. A rocker arm would shake off the excess sand, and the sanded molds were expelled out the other end. Their next invention was a machine to pulverize and mix the clay, sand, and water. The clay was fed into the machine from above, where a set of rollers broke up the larger pieces of clay. Once passing through this grinding machine, the clay was ready for the brick molding machine. The beer lines wanted to perfect this machine even more, so they sold the rights to manufacture it to Joseph S. The new beer line tempering machine looked a little more complete than its first version. The clay was still fed into the top of the machine, where it first encountered a set of rollers. However, the next set of grinders were vertical instead of horizontal. Once again, the beer lines turned over the manufacturing rights of this machine to Joseph S. The beer lines also produced brick molds, which likely included the fancier ones that stamped the name Chaska into each brick. In addition, they also produced brick trucks and wheelbarrows for the brickyards. Since they could make these products locally, the brickyard owners did not have to pay shipping charges for them. The final jewel for the beer lines was producing a brick molding machine, which they did by the early 1890s. They named their machine the Nameless Brick Machine, and even recommended a certain kind of steam engine to go with it. As the beer lines were also brickyard owners, they knew the type of machine that would work best with Chaska clay. The clay was fed into the top of the machine, where it was pressed downward by various blades. Meanwhile, the sanded brick molds were fed into the side of the machine one by one. A plunger would force the clay down into the molds, and the filled molds would be ejected out the front. This is a side view of the Nameless Brick Machine. About the time the Nameless Brick Machine was completed, the wooden beer line machine shop burned down. The beer lines wanted Chaska to contribute a substantial amount of money to help them rebuild, which did not happen. However, Shakopee, just across the Minnesota River from Chaska, was willing to help. Therefore, the production of the Nameless Brick Machine shifted to a new Shakopee plant. The Chaska Brickyards, and many others, used this machinery produced by the beer line and S families. The methods of drying brick continued to change. As the filled brick molds came out of the brick machines, they were now dumped on wooden brick pallets. These pallets were stackable, then were loaded on iron cars that had special grooves on the side to hold multiple pallets. When a car was full, it was pushed to the drying racks. For high-output brickyards with limited drying space, building up was a logical way to go. Covering these drying racks with roofs helped keep out the elements. The open slots in the drying racks also allowed air to flow more freely, which dried the bricks faster. However, this method still required the bricks to be turned, which is something the younger boys could do. When the bricks had fully dried, they were returned to the iron cars, which could be pushed to the kilns. There they still had to be offloaded again and stacked for firing. Although the process was smoother, it was still labor-intensive. The process of burning the bricks in the kilns had also changed. In the old days, the kiln was made entirely out of wood. This included the roof and all the sides. This process was not that efficient for holding heat. Arches were built in the stacks of unburned bricks, where the wood fires were burned. Michael Beerline began a new process that the other brickyards soon adopted. He updated his kilns with solid brick walls to hold the heat better. That is what he called patent casings. However, as this picture shows, the roof was still built of wood, so the new kiln also had its limitations for holding heat. The Chaska Brickyards burned huge kilns of brick. This newspaper article mentions that one kiln had 51 arches and contained 1.5 million brick. That is impressive. Since most Chaska brick were used in Minneapolis and St. Paul, trains were the primary means of transport. Both the Chaska railroads had exclusive brick trains. The Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad even published a schedule of its brick train, which ran between Chaska and Cologne, where it could make the connection to Minneapolis. During its peak in the early 1880s, 25 to 30 boxcars per day of just brick were shipped out of Chaska. As for factor prices, fuel and labor were both costly. However, wood tended to be less readily available. By 1890, the Chaska Brickyards were producing about 30 million brick per year. Since 2,000 brick required about a cord of wood to burn, the necessary amount of wood each year was staggering. In 1890, 15,000 cords of wood were used. That was enough wood, if stacked end to end, to stretch from Chaska to Minneapolis. The main government policies revolved around several financial panics. One panic occurred in 1884, but did not affect Minneapolis or St. Paul as greatly as other eastern cities. A second panic occurred in 1893, which had much more influence in Chaska and the Twin Cities. Prices of related goods in the Chaska area tended to be variable, but did not affect the brick supply very much. Moving to the demand factors, the price of the goods was closely tied to transportation costs. For St. Paul, brick purchased locally were cheaper than those purchased at Chaska. The income of buyers also varied throughout the 1881 to 1893 time frame. However, it could be broken down even further into a local component and an out-of-town component. Locally, in the early to mid-1880s, Chaska enjoyed a business and building boom. Wheat was still king, as the graphic on the right shows. The farmers in Carver County also raised a lot of stock, which was an important aspect of diversified farming. By the late 1880s and early 1890s, Chaska reported dull economic times. It was much easier to sell brick locally during good times rather than the bad times. As for the out-of-town aspect, this chart deals specifically with the cost of buildings erected in Minneapolis. There was a building boom in the early 1880s, followed by a steady period throughout the mid to late 1880s. The early 1890s featured a decline, or a slowdown. The prices of related goods were favorable for builders during most of this period, although prices did decline in the early 1890s. As for brick production in the early 1880s, Chaska and Minneapolis were the highest producers. By 1888, a new competitor had entered the market, the Brickyards of St. Paul. Costs of other building materials also depended on where they were located. The tastes or preferences of consumers remained the same, but competition had become stronger. In adjusting to greater competition, many Chaska Brickyards located company representatives in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Finally, consumer expectations also fluctuated between highs and lows. Let's move on to the year-by-year statistics, starting with the Brickyard owners. In 1881, Lucian Warner and Gregan Griswold were still working together in a brick supply and contracting business in St. Paul. However, by 1882, Gregan Griswold split off on their own, initially focusing on Minneapolis. Gregan Griswold could supply the bricks and do the contracting. In addition, they could also supply the lime for the jobs, after buying a lime business in River Falls, Wisconsin. James Burris, a St. Paul contractor, teamed up with the beer lines of Chaska to form a brick supply and contracting business. Burris eventually bought out the beer lines before selling out to Herman Brinkhouse. Christian Hermeyer, a St. Paul brick, coal, and wood dealer, started a Chaska Brickyard with Charles H. Gerber in 1889. Having a St. Paul or Minneapolis contractor or businessman as a second partner seemed to be a necessity. If not, having a Chaska businessman as a partner also became common. Henning and Melvin were both involved in Chaska stores, although with different partners. Strobach and Greiner teamed up with Linenfelser and Faber, who owned a general store in Chaska. Barker teamed up with Otto Streisguth, the beer lines with Fred Eder, and the Burkhart brothers with Michael Long. The Chaska brickmakers still rarely advertised their products. This advertisement, from the Rydell brothers, was a rare find. In 1881, Gregg and Griswold had the largest brickyard, the 50 in the upper right-hand corner being the number of men they employed. By 1884 and 1885, Strobach, Greiner, Faber, and Lindenfelser employed the most men in 2 separate yards. One article in the local newspaper claimed their yards were the largest west of Chicago. Even in 1887, as this breakdown of brick production shows, the Strobach, Greiner, and Faber yards produced about twice the brick of the other yards. However, after the 1890 season, the Greiners split off from Strobach and Faber. The numbers across the bottom represent the total number of men employed in the brickyards for those years. Take these numbers as estimates, though, as the actual counts varied throughout the season, and sometimes it seemed like the local newspaper stretched the truth a little. Now let's look at the brick production locations throughout these years. The first map is for 1881, which is shown in the lower left. The colors of the brickyard owners on the left sidebar matches their brickyard locations on the map. In this instance, the Beerline and Rydell yard is the dark green area starred on the map. In 1881, the Beerline and Rydell brickyard was the first to locate north of the railroad tracks in Chaska, away from the threat of river flooding. The other 4 yards remained on the eastern edge of town. Quite a few changes took place in 1882. The Beerlines and Rydells each went their own way, splitting their north side brickyard in 2. Strobach, Greiner, Faber, and Lindenfelser, who owned a yard on the eastern edge of Chaska, opened a second yard north of the railroad tracks. Weist also opened a second yard. Finally, Howe and Barker returned to Chaska to open a yard. There was no change in brickyard locations until 1887, when Weist sold a second yard to Barker and Streisguth, who were running out of space at their original yard. In 1888, the Beerlines sold their share in their north side brickyard to James Burris, and purchased a new yard on the eastern edge of Chaska. The long-running Gregg and Griswold brickyard was sold to Henry Strobach. 1889 brought an expansion to the northwest edge of Chaska by the Burkharts and Long. Gerber and Hermeyer purchased a new yard on the north edge of town. The Beerlines and Eder bought out Andrew Weist. In 1890, the Burkharts and Simons bought an additional parcel of land north of the railroad tracks. The Beerlines opened another brickyard just to the south of the Burkhart parcel. The following year, Strobach, Greiner, and Faber split up. Greiner worked the old Gregg and Griswold brickyard and a portion of Henning and Melvin's yard. Meanwhile, Strobach and Faber maintained their original yards and added a portion of the Henning and Melvin yard. In 1892, Barker got out of the brickyard business, and in 1893, Eder also went out of business. As for population, Chaska continued a slow growth, going from 1,725 in 1885 to 2,210 in 1890. St. Paul grew to around 133,000 by 1890, while Minneapolis increased to around 165,000. The number of Chaska brickyards peaked in 1890 and 1891 at 9. Between 1884 and 1893, Chaska produced around 30 million brick per year. Several issues of the Chaska newspaper claimed that around 50 million were produced in 1890. However, other sources said the figure remained around 30 million. There were other clues that 50 million was likely an exaggeration. The Chaska brick boom occurred from 1881 to 1884. Then there was a period of stagnation, which was actually a steady demand. By the early 1890s, the brickyards were cutting production due to slow sales. When combining these statistics with the cost of buildings erected in Minneapolis, they correlate pretty well. The brick boom matched the Minneapolis building boom. The stagnation period at the Chaska brickyards matched the steady growth period at Minneapolis. However, the Chaska brickyards kept producing around 30 million brick per year in the early 1890s, even though the demand in Minneapolis had dropped. That led to financial problems for the Chaska Brickyard owners. Finally, remember there were two financial panics across the United States during this period, one in 1884 and the other in 1893. Roughly 30 million brick were produced each year in Chaska between 1884 and 1893, which is a total of 300 million brick. 800,000 Chaska brick were used to construct the Metropolitan Hotel in St. Paul. 300 million brick could build 375 Metropolitan hotels. That is a lot of brick. So where did all these brick go? Most continued to go to Minneapolis and St. Paul. At St. Paul, Chaska brick were used in the Cleveland School, the Webster School, the Van Buren School, the St. Paul Agricultural Works, the St. Paul and Duluth Railroad Shops, the Kramer Building, the Wan Building, the Ramsey County Courthouse, the Ryan Hotel, the Administration Building of the City Hospital, St. Mary's Asylum, the St. Paul Chamber of Commerce Building, the Hotel Bartow, and the St. Paul City Railway Powerhouse Building. In Minneapolis, Chaska brick were used in the Mackey Leg Building, the Minneapolis Chamber of Commerce, the Minneapolis Industrial Exposition Building, the Custom House, the Minneapolis Tribune Building, the Union Depot, the Scandia Bank Building, Seward School, the Steel Building, Temple Court Building, the Washburn Orphans Home, and the West Hotel. Chaska brick were used in the barracks buildings at Fort Snelling, St. John's Catholic Church at Vermilion, Citizens State Bank at Cannon Falls, the YMCA at Northfield, the Ladies' Hall at Carleton College in Northfield, the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad Shops at Austin, the Waseca Mill, the City Hall at New Prague, the High School in Shakopee, the Courthouse Addition in Chaska, the City Hall and Engine House in Chaska, the Public School in Chaska, Guardian Angels Catholic Church in Chaska, the Moravian Church in Chaska, St. John's Lutheran Church and School in Chaska, the Lutheran Church in Waconia, the Catholic Church in Glencoe, the Roundhouse in Morton, and an Odd Fellows building in Montevideo. However, this is by no means a complete list. In closing, here is another quote from the book 60 Years a Brickmaker by J.W. Crary. That concludes the video. Please check out my websites at mnbricks.com and chaskabrick.com.